Okay, so what we've been doing is looking at different um, theories of therapy and thinking about the ways in which they're similar and can be linked to psychological language such as schemas, templates, procedural memory, encoding, representation, etc. I think sometimes the reason why um, we may not see the psychology in theories of therapy is because the languages often don't fit in to current modern psychological language. So I'm going to try and move on and illustrate what I mean by that. So if we look at different domains of functioning as human beings, we can think of broad overall domains such as conscious awareness, which is of course quite a fraught concept. In fact, consciousness. What is consciousness? What do we mean by unconscious? Representation, forming memories, remembering our past. Emotion, our feeling states, the biological processes, hunger, sex drive, etc. All of which, of course, are parts of modern psychology. So if we think about each of these in turn, for example, in terms of conscious awareness and the kinds of stuff in psychology, there is a psychological literature on consciousness. For example, Bernard Baars wrote a book on a psychological theory of consciousness. Daniel Dennett has written about the evolutionary implications of consciousness. Alan Badley's notion of the central executive in the working memory model is about how we plan from moment to moment and make decisions about how we're going to try and carry out particular tasks. Tim Challies talks about the supervisory attention system, how on a day-to-day basis, if we have to deal with a novel activity, we have to bring in conscious controlled processes. The notion of controlled processing is about how we have to actively think through novel situations. Working memory is about how we actively maintain within conscious awareness particular ideas. Short-term memory is the same kind of idea. In working memory at any given time, we can remember very complicated stimuli. For example, if you were to close your eyes now, you could probably remember the sound of my voice for a few seconds. On the other hand, if you were to close your eyes, you could probably remember what the inside of your living room or lounge looks like. So we can remember sound, we can remember vision. If I asked you to close your eyes now and think of a hot summer's day and the warm, gentle smell of mown fresh grass, I'm sure you could conjure up that smell. So we're able to bring all kinds of things into conscious awareness at any given time. And another word we might use for that conscious, ongoing thinking, decision-making process could be ego. In terms of representation, we've already come across the notion of schemas and templates, objects, object recognition, representation of self versus other, automatic processing, things that we can do without thinking about it, reading, for example. Conditioning could be seen as a type of representation where we learn to do certain things, we have reflex actions. Long-term memory, which can be episodic, things about ourselves and what we've done in the past, versus semantic, our knowledge of facts and things and general knowledge. Procedural memory, remembering how to do things. Implicit and subliminal processing, how our memory can affect our current thinking without us even realizing it. Priming effects in the laboratory have been shown to be very subtle indeed. So other languages used, particularly within the psychodynamic tradition, conditioning, remembering, our attitudes and feelings being affected by particular courses of action, kind of fits in with the notion of the superego. Schemas, templates, our memory of ourselves versus other fits in with the notion of object representations. Emotional processing, we can think of the autonomic nervous system, fight or flight mechanisms, stress, learned helplessness, reward mechanisms, feeling good when we carry out a particular action. We can think of related concepts around attachment, secure versus anxious avoidant. Thinking about the biological side of our lives, eating, drinking, sexual behavior, aggression, maternal instincts, paternal instincts, we could mention there as well for the sake of completeness. And this seems to broadly fit in with the notion of id, biological drives. So I guess a point we might make here is that the psychodynamic language often seems to be somewhat at odds or different to the psychological languages that we know as psychologists. However, what we have to remember is that Freud had to invent a language, as did other workers in the 30s and 40s, at a time when psychology itself lacked the appropriate terminology. But one might contend that now in modern psychology, particularly with the advent of cognitive psychology in the 1950s, which in a sense was a new experimental phenomenology, terms that Freud might have found acceptable are now there. It's very interesting if you read the original, some of the original writing by Freud, that when he's talking about consciousness and the unconscious, you could almost take the word consciousness out of Freud's writing and substitute working memory, and you could almost take the word unconscious and substitute long-term memory, and the sense of Freud's writing actually works perfectly well. Which makes me wonder whether this in fact was the way Freud was thinking. We know that the vast majority of our long-term memory, our long-term episodic memory, is in fact inaccessible. Most of us have no recollection whatsoever of our early childhoods, certainly from before the age of 3. And even as adults, we have very little memory of times gone by. So, for example, if I was to ask you what you were doing on the 25th of December 1998, which for many people would be quite a significant day, of course, because it's Christmas Day in Western Christian culture, and yet I would be very surprised if many people could give a detailed account of what they were doing on the 25th of December in 1998. So as Freud observed, the vast majority of the past experiences we have are in fact unconscious. But that does not mean to say, nevertheless, that they're not having an experience on our current lives, and particularly through the way in which our early experiences continue to play out in our adult relationships. So we can see all of these different concepts within psychology: the central executive ego, decision-making, conscious processing, cognitive processes, emotion, biological drives, past experience, representation, schemas, etc. That's all being relevant to therapy. And within therapy, this is an interaction between two people. So all of these concepts are relevant not only to the client, but also to the therapist. So the psychology can help us to understand the self of the client, but the psychology also helps us to understand the process in the relationship. And we might be able to understand particular client issues through referring to particular parts of this psychology. So, for example, a client with a particular phobia which may have been conditioned in reaction to the environment, which leads to a certain level of emotion, which then causes them to have catastrophic thoughts in conscious processing. On the other hand, another client may have had particular issues presented to them as a child, which has led to development of certain schematic ways of thinking about themselves that now lead to them interacting with other people in a particular way. So we can see how two clients, one through conditioning and one through schemas, we can conceptualize their issues in quite different ways according to bringing in different psychological processes. And all of this, as I said earlier, is going on in the therapeutic relationship itself. The self-structure will affect the client and aspects of themselves and how they relate to the other person, whereas aspects of the issues may depend on how the therapist makes sense of particular issues. So there's a dynamic interaction between those two people in a relationship who each have complex personal psychologies. And given what I've just said, that this modern psychologically informed way of looking at clients in therapy is a dynamic process. It goes on between the therapist and the client, both of their complex psychologies interacting in this very dynamic way through time. Is this not, one might argue, a psychodynamic view of the world? So if we accept then that psychology gives us the opportunity to bring together all these different therapeutic ideas from different therapeutic modalities and to see ourselves truly as counselling psychologists, what is the advantage of this? Well, it gives us a clear link and continuity from undergraduate psychology to postgraduate training. It means that all of the different models that are out there, and there are about 450 of them at the moment, can be actually owned and integrated to form a coherent identity as a counselling psychologist. And as we mature as counselling psychologists, there is nothing to stop us integrating more and more of the different ideas that are out there. And just to give you one example, personally I have found solution-focused views to be very helpful with many clients who do not wish to dwell on the psychopathology of their thinking, but merely want to be given and facilitated through positive solution-focused ways forward. And finally, it positions counselling psychology well as a profession from which psychotherapy positions and innovations emanate. In effect, what we're saying as counselling psychologists is that we can own the whole of the therapeutic marketplace, the whole of the therapeutic ideas, that all of these ideas are in fact part of psychology. Sometimes we have to do a bit of work to find the translation and make the language work across, but it's all in fact part of psychology. And just to finish off, I've referred to these various books on the way through, but in putting forward this presentation and thinking about these ideas, here are some of the key references to which I have referred myself. I hope that this has been an interesting set of presentations. I hope you agree with me that it is a sensible way forward for counselling psychology to see itself more firmly anchored within the discipline of psychology itself, and I would be very interested in any reactions and views that you might want to forward to me. Thank you.